In this video, we are going to continue taking a more in-depth look at the various shifters of supply. Just like in the first of these, or all of these, I think, that I'm going to do, before we start looking at these individual ones, I want to talk briefly just about an overarching theme, right? And that is something you've heard me say probably 3 or 4 times now at this point. The supply curve is based off of the costs of production, right? So it shouldn't be very surprising that most of these different shifters of demand directly impact the cost of production. Whenever we increase the cost of production, that requires producers to get more money for the same number of products that they were producing before, right? And so that's what changes our curves, right? And vice versa for a decrease in costs, right? So just something that we want to kind of really hammer home, all right, and make sure that we're focusing on that, right? With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the first, maybe the only one that we cover in this video. It depends on how long I ramble for. All right, but the first thing is taxes and subsidies. All right, so taxes and subsidies are definitely going to have an impact on supply. Right, they are going to change those costs of production, right? So of course taxes, that's the government saying, hey, give me money. Subsidies are the government saying, hey, here's some money. That's, you know, if you want to really just break it down, all right? So those are definitely going to change the way that those production costs look. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into it. All right, so for taxes, these are going to be, they're different things, all right? They're kind of the opposite things, so they're going to act differently. All right, so we'll go ahead and do these one at a time. All right, so starting with our taxes, if a tax is placed on the production of a good, supply is going to decrease, right? And the opposite is true as well. So a tax on production, or excuse me, the opposite is true. It is true, but I wasn't writing that. I'll just go ahead and I'll just say this one. All right, so of course the opposite is true. If a tax on production is lifted, right, we should see an increase in supply. Right, and this should make sense. Taxes essentially just act as additional costs for production, right? If I have to pay a tax after producing a good, right, I still have to make that money up, right, when I'm selling my good, right? So the amount of money I need to be able to sell however much, right, that's going to increase. Right, so basically, again, nothing too crazy. Right, the basic gist is that if you have a tax on production, supply is going to decrease. Right, if a tax is lifted, supply will increase. One thing I do want to point out is that most of the time when you see something about a tax in either the homework or the test, you are going to just assume that it's a tax on production. Right, so even if I just say the government places a tax on blank good, you don't have to worry about, is this a tax on consumers or a tax on producers? Just assume that it's on producers, all right? The only time that you might see something about taxes that doesn't have to do with supply is if it relates to income, right? So if we are talking about changes in income taxes, right, or something like that, that's going to affect, you know, income, obviously, right? And that's a demand shifter, not a supply shifter, right? So just hopefully that doesn't confuse anybody, but wanted to just go ahead and let us kind of put that out there in case it did. All right, but we know how taxes are going to affect supply, so let's go ahead and look at an example of this. All right, so let's kind of go ahead and draw out our curve, and we are going to use canned soda. All right, so this is what we used in the last video. I'll see I might have to change it at some point. It might not really fit with some of the other things, but we'll see. All right, so let's say that we've got this market for canned soda. Right, we're specifically looking at supply. And this is going to be very similar to the price of inputs thing. I'm actually going to make it pretty much identical. But because it's the same concept, right? Fundamentally, what's happening in most of these is changes to the price of production, right? But let's say that at the initial one, right, kind of the y-intercept for our original supply curve is at 20 cents, right? So simplifying it a little bit, we could say I have to get 20 cents to be able to provide anything, right? And if I don't get 20 cents, then I'm making a loss, right? Technically, it'd be at least or more than 20 cents, more than 20 cents to be earned. But again, try to keep it simple. We'll just say equal to, right? So at the kind of the bottom end over here, right? I need at least 20 cents per soda, right? Or I'm making a loss, right? So now we're going to say we've got our shock. All right, and that shock is that kind of after some increased concerns about the health risks associated with, or the kind of the health effects of drinking a lot of sodas, right? In an attempt to curtail that behavior, the government places a 5-cent tax per can on sodas. All right, looking at this, we can say, well, placing a tax on sodas, that's clearly kind of a tax on production. So whenever we have a tax, supply is going to decrease, right? Because we're increasing that cost of production, right? And so we're going to see a decrease in supply, right? Very much like with how changes in the price affect supply. We look at this and we say, well, let's say, go back to this 20 cents per can. If I, in the original, need 20 cents per can to break even, right? And now, right, taking those costs of 20 cents, adding on top of that the 5-cent tax per can, right? Now how much am I going to need to break even? Right? Our answer should be 25 cents, right? So we're going to have 25 cents to cover the initial costs, right? The actual costs of production, right? The more traditional ones, right? The cost of the aluminum cans, the cost of the water and syrup that we put in there, the electricity it takes to run our machines, so on and so forth, right? So we're going to have to cover those costs, right, which are 20 cents per can, right? And we're going to have to pay this tax, all right? We're going to have to pay this 5-cent tax. So now, with my new supply curve, I am starting with a intercept of 25 because that is the minimum I need. So when you look at kind of the difference between our original curve and our new one, right, that difference is the amount of the tax. In this case, 5 cents. All right, so that was, again, pretty straightforward, especially when we really start buckling down on the idea that changes in production costs are going to change supply. All right, so that being said, let's move on to subsidies. All right, so for anyone who is not familiar with subsidies, they are essentially what I said at the beginning of this video. It's when the government gives you money to produce something, right? That's the most boiled down, straightforward definition, right? They are pretty common, depending on the industry you're in, right? So for example, the agricultural industry has a lot of subsidies, a lot of farm subsidies, right? Other things like, and it's also going to depend on which government agency is doing it, right? I know that when President Obama was in office, there were a lot of subsidies for green initiatives, right? So green technologies, alternative power sources, kind of wanting to encourage development of technology that will move us away from fossil fuels, right? So that is kind of what subsidies are generally used for. kind of the opposite of a tax, and I didn't actually mention this. So taxes, a lot of times, one, they bring in revenue, but governments will also use them to try to curtail certain types of behavior, right? So you may or may not be familiar with sin taxes, S-I-N taxes, but those are the taxes on things like alcohol, tobacco, and playing cards, right? If you ever buy any of those three things, you'll sometimes find a sticker on there. It's a little sticker. It's probably about that big. It looks like it's like a smaller stamp. And I have the state of Alabama, a drawing of it, and then it'll say like 5 cents or something, right? Those are sin taxes. Those were designed to kind of discourage people, right, or make it more costly for people to buy those things. Nowadays, they're like, I mean, it's like 5 cents for kind of everything, so there's really not that much of a difference cost-wise, right? But that is one thing taxes can be used for, aside from just gathering revenue. Subsidies are the flip side of that, right? It was a long walk to get there, but now we're back to where we began. If there is some industry or some product that the government wants to encourage the production of, then they might use subsidies there. All right. So for kind of agricultural stuff, the main argument I hear for that is wanting to keep food production going in the U.S. because it's good to make food in your country, right, within the bounds of your country in case something happens. Things like the green initiative type stuff, that's more about just promoting this, right? We want these industries to be successful. We want these new technologies, so we will promote them. All right, so all that being said, it's probably not surprising that when we have a subsidy, when the production of a good is subsidized, we are expecting to see an increase in supply. Right. Again, the reason for this follows very much the same logic as it does for taxes, just kind of the reverse. Right? If we were to say, let's go ahead and get the next example up. Go ahead and look at that. Let's see. I don't really want to do my canned soda thing. We'll take a break from canned soda. Right? So let's say we're looking at corn. I don't know. All right, we've got our original curve here. And let's go ahead and put something down here. So let's say that, whatever the units are for corn, let's say in the original we've got kind of our y-intercept where our supply curve intersects our price axis is at 10. Right? So kind of saying that the lowest that anybody will produce this good for is slightly more than $10 or whatever the units are. Right, so, and we'll say, just for simplicity's sake, we'll say this is per bushel. I don't really know how much corn costs. That seems high, but I also don't know what a bushel is, so that's not helpful either. All right, so let's say that the shock is that the government subsidizes corn for $5 per bushel. Again, don't know if these numbers make any sense at all, but that's kind of beside the point. All right, with this shock, all right, government subsidizes corn for $5 a bushel. One, it's pretty easy to know what shock we're talking about. It's subsidies, right, because it says it in there. All right, when we have a subsidy, supply is going to increase. Now, when we are looking at this, kind of that increase in supply, right, is going to look a lot like the decrease in supply from taxes. Right? The difference in the original and then the secondary, or then the after the shock curves for the taxes, the difference between those was the tax. The same is going to be true here for the subsidies. Right? The difference between our original supply curve and the new supply curve is going to be the difference of that subsidy. right? Because if we are at $10, right, if originally before the shock we're at $10 per bushel is what I need to break even, right? Well, now if the government's saying, well, hey, we'll pay $5 on that, right? Now all I need to do is find somebody else that's willing to pay $5, an additional $5, and I got my $10, right? So I get $5 from the government, $5 from a consumer, and I'm breaking even, and I'm very happy, right? And that is what we would see, right? So now, kind of all the producers, right, or assume that all the producers can get the subsidy, I guess. All of the producers can now charge $5 less than they needed to previously in order to break even. So we see that shift to the right, all right, and an increase in supply. So at any given price, there's now going to be more of this provided. All right, I think we can fit in a second one, so we're going to go ahead and try that. All right, the next one is expectations. All right, so expectations, producer expectations, which that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about it in the context of supply. So producer expectations are going to have an effect on supply. Just like with expectations for demand, all right, that as a demand shifter, right, there are kind of two ways we can look at it. Right, one is the monetary aspect, so essentially expectations about future prices, right, and also non-monetary, all right. But for the price aspect or price side, if producers expect the price in the future to increase, let me clarify that a little bit. All right, so if producers expect future prices to, man, I cannot get this out. I'm going to get there. Okay, there we go. All right, apparently can't do two things at once. All right, so if producers expect future prices to increase, then supply today is going to decrease. Right? The reason for this is because if producers are expecting higher prices in the future, then some of them might stockpile their goods. Right? So say instead of getting a lower price today, right, I'm going to wait and try to get that higher price. So I'm going to take my goods. I'm not going to sell them today, right? So they're not available, right? I'm not willing to sell them, so they don't factor into supply, right? And then I'm going to sell them later on. All right, and of course the opposite is true as well, right? If you expect future prices to decrease, then supply today will increase, where you're trying to essentially dump your goods and get that higher price before the price goes down. Right? That's a kind of a simplification of it, but that is in essence what is happening. All right, just like with our expectations in as far as with the demand side goes, and again, just to clarify, right? When we're talking about supply, we're talking about producer expectations. Right, so what expectations the producers have. When we're talking about expectations in demand, we're talking about the expectations of consumers. Right, so that is an important distinction because we have expectations on both of our lists for supply shifter, or for shifters. Right, it's on demand and it's on the supply list. Right, but there is an important distinction there. All right, but just like with the demand side of things, it's not just expectations about prices that can affect supply, other expectations can as well. All right, so similarly to kind of, we did an example, I believe we did an example of, right, demand for kind of gas when there's a hurricane, right? The supply of gas would also be affected by the expectation of a hurricane, right? For multiple reasons, right? If you expect, especially the Gulf is my frame of reference, so if there's an oil rig in the Gulf, right, and they expect a hurricane to go through there, right, they might close that rig down and kind of shut everything down, and the people on the rig go into shore so that they can be safer. So that's going to decrease the amount of crude oil getting anywhere. All right, and then they might even shut any refineries on the coast down to prevent them from kind of getting damaged, or if they do get damaged, from causing further damage. Right, so on and so forth. Right, and all of those things again can kind of lead to a decrease in supply. All right. But let's quickly look at an example. We'll just go back to canned soda because it doesn't really matter what we're looking at for this one, I'll be honest. So let's say that the shock is that this one doesn't make that much sense. Actually, let's change that. Let's not do canned soda. That one doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Although it could, yeah. I'm gonna flip flop about 5 more times, but no, we're gonna stick with canned soda. All right. All right, I could have made that a lot smaller, but that's okay. So let's say that our shock is that producers expect prices to rise in the future. All right, so I don't know what would cause that, but that's okay. All right, but let's just say that they expect that. All right, maybe, this Super Bowl's coming up, so they know they can jack the prices up. I don't know, something like that. Not that, but it doesn't matter, right? They expect prices to rise in the future. All right, so if producers are expecting prices to rise in the future, right, they're probably going to keep more of their product in warehouses, right, send less of it out, all right, and so at least for today, all right, so supply today is going to decrease, right, because those producers are wanting to take advantage of the higher prices that they expect in the future. All right, so we'll go ahead and that's it for expectations. Again, we could also have some of those non-price based expectations, but really the kind of price ones are kind of a bit clearer from the production side. Right? But that is it for our expectations. Just to recap kind of what went on. Right? So we looked at taxes and subsidies. Right? Taxes act as an additional cost. So when we have a tax on production, supply is going to decrease. Subsidies do the opposite. They kind of act as a decrease in the cost of production. And so when we have a subsidy on some good, right, we expect the supply of that good to increase. And then finally, with expectations, if producers expect future prices to increase, right, they are going to decrease their supply today so that they can wait and take advantage of those higher prices. All right, so that is it for this video. Getting through those two means that we only have 2 of these left, so we will probably knock those out in the next video.